we're going to talk about the last year of Malcolm X. So why study Malcolm X? Malcolm is, was, and always will be a towering figure in the history of the Black liberation struggle. He was an uncompromising militant, an implacable foe of America, racism, and reformism. He lived an incredible life and had a remarkable ability to grow and change, to admit error and correct it. He made enormous advances in the ideas, the political ideas of the movement at the time. Those advances include raising the call to struggle by any means necessary. In other words, rejecting pacifism, rejecting legalism, and that's an enormous advance. He showed unwavering hostility toward the system, toward reformism, and toward the twin capitalist parties. He compared Democrats to foxes and Republicans to wolves. And his identification with anti-racism with anti-imperialism at the end of his life was also a tremendous advance in the movement. So I didn't do a table of or an outline or a table of contents or whatever. I did a word cloud because I'm a bit of a mess. But I'm basically going to be talking about Malcolm X's life in order, in chronological order, and go through, some key events, leaving out way more than I want to, of course. So here are some of the themes that I want to talk about. But I'm going to start with my encounter with Malcolm X, which came through hip hop in the late 80s. Initially, so not from school. This is Chuck D in a Fruit of Islam uniform in his days, I guess before Public Enemy. This is 1988's smash album, where KRS-One is imitating this famous 1964 picture of Malcolm X, which he had taken and ran in Life magazine, and it was kind of a threat to the Nation of Islam after they, were attacking him. Oh, I forgot the spoiler alert, I guess. Here's also in 1988, this is Public Enemy again, or Public Enemy, the whole group. Minus Flav, of course, but the S1Ws kind of adopted some of the paramilitary vibe of the Fruit of Islam, which was the Nation of Islam's security force. They also had membership overlap. So you can see some of, like at least two of them have that FOI collar on. I then read the autobiography of Malcolm X, which I highly recommend to everyone. My kids read it when COVID hit. I think it's really important. I went to see Farrakhan speak in I don't know what, 1990 probably. I lived in LA, and when Rodney King was beaten, and when the LA uprising happened. And by the way, this happens to be a picture of the Socialist Workers' Party's bookstore in LA, which got burned down during the riots or during the uprising. Not intentionally, it just sort of, was collateral damage, but I had been there, and the SWP was big into Malcolm X, and that, affected me when I was young too. And then later, the same year as the uprising, Spike Lee's Masterpiece came out, which I also recommend. By the way, a lot of the color, I've used a few stills here and there from the movie, which should stand out. And then since then, I've read a bunch of books about Malcolm X. and read his speeches and watched his speeches. Definitely, you could spend days on YouTube watching Malcolm X speeches. This book will, kind of hops around a bunch, but The Last Year of Malcolm X by George Brightman, which we sort of read a condensed version, like a pamphlet that Brightman wrote, but that explores some similar themes. But I want to go through some of the stuff in this book. Here is a timeline of Malcolm's life, just in brief, that I've broken out into 3 phases: his youth, his time in the Nation of Islam, which he joined while in prison at age 23, I guess, and then his independent phase, very important phase of his life. But you can see he was started off in Nebraska, Omaha, as a small child, spent most of his childhood in Lansing, Michigan, moved to Boston, was sentenced to prison, spent like 7 years in prison, converted to the Nation of Islam there, and then spent basically the rest of his life splitting time between New York, Detroit, and Boston. And then he also took 3 trips in 2 different years to the Middle East and Africa, which are really important. So here he is as a real young man. So Malcolm was born in Omaha, Nebraska. His dad was a Baptist minister and a Black nationalist and a supporter of Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey promoted Black capitalism, self-help. Marcus Garvey is a kind of another towering figure in Black liberation politics. He promoted Black capitalism, self-help, racial pride, and back to Africa separatism. And CLR James said of Garvey, before Garvey, there was no Black movement. Since Garvey, there has been continuous Black movement. All of us stand on the shoulders of Marcus Garvey. In that year, when he was born, the family was terrorized, I think this is a few years later. Sorry, this should say 1929. The family's Lansing home, Michigan home. The family's home in Lansing, Michigan was burned to the ground. Oh no, I'm sorry, that's later. So not only did they get run out of Omaha by the KKK, their home, when they moved to Lansing, was burned to the ground by the Black Legion, these white supremacist terrorists. They also probably killed Malcolm's father. Malcolm dropped out of school after 8th grade after a teacher told him that his aspirations of being a lawyer were no realistic goal for an N-word. He ended up moving to Boston and where he lived with his sister. This is a terrific sequence in both the book and the movie, where he was into swing dancing and zoot suits and all that. In 1946, Malcolm was 21. He was arrested for burglary. He ended up spending 7 years in a Massachusetts state prison. So we kind of enter the next phase here, because in 1948, when he was 23, Malcolm converted to the Nation of Islam in prison. Then in 1952, he's released from prison, and the same year he changes his name to X, his last name to X, which is meant to indicate like an unknown quantity, and the severing of an African past due to enslavement. In 1953, the FBI opened a file on Malcolm after an informant claimed he described himself as a communist. And he also became the assistant minister of a Nation of Islam temple in Detroit and established another temple in Boston. So a year out of prison, and he's really like a very important figure in the nation. In 1954, he was promoted to the minister of the NOI's Harlem Temple number 7, another important outpost for them. And so a little bit about the Nation of Islam. They had conservative ideas combining Orthodox Islam with outlandish, evil, scientist, outer space shit, to be honest. They emphasized hard work, thrift, obedience, humility, self-respect, self-reliance, and Black pride, and puritanical sexual morality. They advocated for Black capitalism, economic independence from white society, and separatism. They appealed to young recruits with unabashed condemnation of white America and a rejection of integration and nonviolence. When integrationists were the dominant kind of force or face of the civil rights movement. They were also racial essentialists, and anti-Semitic and regressive on gender and sexuality. So a little bit about Black nationalism. Brightman defines it as the tendency for Black people in the US to unite as a group, as a people, into a movement of their own to fight for freedom, justice, and equality. It's characterized by racial pride, group consciousness, hatred of white supremacy, a striving for independence from white control, identification with Black and non-white oppressed groups everywhere. Malcolm remained a Black nationalist to his last day. Religion, this is Brightman's contention, and I agree with it. Religion was not Malcolm's dominant concern, even as a Black Muslim. And Malcolm injected Black nationalism into the Black Muslim movement, to where they, I think, kind of became inseparable. And then one last note, one can be a Black nationalist without being a separatist. So to say more about separatism and integrationism, at this time, integrationism was rejected by many Black people as tokenism and gradualism. They didn't see it working out. They saw integration happening without any material changes to their lives, or some level of integration. It can also mean assimilation and dispersal, reducing Black people's ability to defend their common interests against whites. By contrast, separatism means the favoring of, in this context, means favoring withdrawal of Black people into their own nation. Malcolm broke with separatism in his last year, but remained in favor of separate Black organization his whole life. So about Malcolm and Martin Luther King, this was from their one and only meeting, actually. And this was during Malcolm's independent phase. Martin was an integrationist, a pacifist, a gradualist, and a reformist, whereas Malcolm was a separatist until his last year. I think we already talked. We already talk about by any means necessary? Yes, I think so. Additionally, he said about violence, he said, I don't even call it violence when it's in self-defense, I call it intelligence, which I think is brilliant and worthy of integration into our vocabulary. And Malcolm was a revolutionary. He believed the system had to go. And I think that's true, from beginning to end. Martin's, and this doesn't just go for Martin Luther King, but the other kind of reformist elements of the civil rights movement, their strategy was a strategy of dependence on liberals, on the government, on the labor bureaucracy, et cetera. they felt that they had to, and because of that, they felt that they had to appeal to the moderate majority. And Martin could be pretty scathing talking about the kind of white moderate, but was still oriented on that as a strategy. Whereas Malcolm's strategy, and especially later on, was one of independent mobilization of Black people. And this made him point in a very different direction and appeal to the militant minority. Malcolm came to see Black people, and just a note on that, Malcolm came to see Black people as part of a global majority. And this framing boosts morale and self-confidence and militancy and tenacity, precisely the qualities that are needed by freedom fighters and that are discouraged among the oppressed. So one Rosa Luxemburg quote that comes up in this whole strategy of dependence versus independence, or appeal to a majority, appeal to a militant minority. Rosa Luxemburg said, not through a majority to revolutionary tactics, but through revolutionary tactics to a majority. Important dialectical lesson. Oh, and before I go on, I want to play a little clip.
The Reverend Martin Luther King preaches a doctrine of nonviolent insistence upon the rights of the American Negro. What is your attitude toward this philosophy?
The white man pays Reverend Martin Luther King, subsidizes Reverend Martin Luther King, so that Reverend Martin Luther King can continue to teach the Negroes to be defenseless. That's what you mean by nonviolent. Be defenseless. Be defenseless in the face of one of the most cruel beasts that has ever taken the people into captivity. That's this American white man. And they have proved it throughout the country by the police dogs and the police clubs. 100 years ago, they used to put on a white sheet and use a bloodhound against Negroes. Today, they have taken off the white sheet and put on police uniforms. They've traded in the bloodhounds for police dogs, and they're still doing the same thing. And just as Uncle Tom, back during slavery, used to keep the Negroes from resisting the bloodhound or resisting the Ku Klux Klan by teaching them to love their enemy or pray for those who use them despitefully. Today, Martin Luther King is just a 20th century or modern Uncle Tom, or a religious Uncle Tom, who is doing the same thing today to keep Negroes defenseless in the face of attack that Uncle Tom did on the plantation to keep those Negroes defenseless in the face of the attacks of the Klan in that day.
So yeah, Malcolm and Martin are often like thought of in the same breath, or talked about in the same breath, but as being sort of cooperative or complementary elements. And that was not the case during, this was pretty late also. That was in June 1963. So, but while he was still in the NOI. So here's a little bit about Marxism on Black nationalism. Marxism considers the nationalism of the oppressed as progressive, and as potentially progressive progressive and potentially revolutionary, while recognizing its limitations, namely a lack of class analysis and class independence. Marxism supports the struggles of the oppressed, even when they express themselves through a nationalist prism. Marxism defends the right of oppressed groups to organize separately without advocating for it or making it a principle. I consider this to be sort of Lenin's attitude toward the right of nations to self-determination, writ small. Yeah, we don't want, yeah, anyway, I got to keep going. So in 1958, Malcolm married Sister Betty X in Lansing, Michigan. They ultimately had 6 daughters together, 2 of whom were born after Malcolm was assassinated. In 1959, Malcolm made his first trip to Africa and the Middle East and Iran. He traveled to Egypt, yeah, you could see Egypt, Ghana, Iran, Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, Sudan, Syria, and the United Arab Emirates. In 1959, there was a TV series made about the Nation of Islam. It was a real fear-mongering documentary. despite their best efforts or because of their best efforts to like slander the nation's membership doubled to 60,000 within weeks. So I love that, how, propaganda can cut one way or another. So the popularity of the nation spiked in the 50s due to telling the white man off in bold and confident tones, criticizing the mainstream civil rights movement. Malcolm's politics and skills as a propagandist, orator, organizer, and teacher, and the sensational media coverage that demonized them helped them with their audience, or some of their audience. The anti-colonial revolutions in Africa and Asia, were in play, and the failures of integration, the failures of the state to enforce school desegregation in particular. In 1960, Malcolm established the Nation of Islam's newspaper. And additionally, when Castro came to New York for a talk at the UN, Midtown hotels balked at booking them, and Malcolm arranged for them to stay in Harlem, and they met, and it was pretty cool, despite not being a fan of Castro. So, all right. So a little bit about the Communist Party USA and the Socialist Party of America, I think. Their reaction to Malcolm and the Nation of Islam. They were hostile to them. They repeated slanders against them and were blind to the progressive aspects of Black nationalism. The CPUSA campaigned for Johnson, for LBJ, and called Malcolm a police agent. To Malcolm, they were indistinguishable from liberals, and to me too. In November 1964, Malcolm called them, and this is specifically referring to the CP, Malcolm called them people who call themselves Marxists, who claim to be enemies of the system, but were on their hands and knees waiting for Johnson to get elected. And I think we should continue to call them that. Socialist Workers Party, which is the organization that George Brightman, the author of the book, was from, were longtime supporters of Malcolm and the chief circulators of his speeches, which George Brightman analyzed and edited for years. They explained and defended Black Muslims and Black nationalism. They did not try to convince Black people to subordinate their struggle to the government, the Democrats, the labor movement, or anything else. They reported on Malcolm, publicized his ideas, and printed his speeches. Malcolm bought, sold, and praised the SWP's newspaper, The Militant. And Malcolm and other Black Muslims spoke at the SWP's events, specifically the Militant Labor Forum, which a lot of his last speeches were delivered at. And the SWP proposed a book to Malcolm of his independent speeches. He liked the idea, he was going to work on it, but he was assassinated a month later. So he didn't get to choose those speeches, but they worked with the NOI and, or I'm sorry, no, they did not work with the NOI, the OAAU and some other folks. And that book became Malcolm X Speaks. The SWP supported Black liberation, or this is sort of why they messed with Malcolm so hard, why the SWP loved Malcolm. In contrast to the other organizations, because they had superior politics, in a word, they supported Black liberation. They viewed racial oppression as the linchpin of capitalism. They viewed Black liberation as central to the socialist project. The SWP supported Malcolm's rejection of reformism, of independence. They supported Malcolm's independence and his revolutionary tendencies. And they wanted to get revolutionary ideas into the hands of Black worker militants. And they recognized the progressive potential of the nationalism of the oppressed. honestly, you might say that they overestimated that potential at turns and thought that it was too automatic. Brightman said the logical outcome of Black nationalism in a country like ours is to reach the most advanced, most radical social and political conclusions. And I guess I would just say that that has to be fought for. That's it's not automatic. In 1961, Malcolm becomes the national rep of the Nation of Islam as Muhammad's health declines, Elijah Muhammad. Malcolm, oh, sorry, next slide. That same year, Malcolm and other Nation of Islam people meet with the KKK. Muhammad said, we want what they want, which is separation. This is not the KKK. This is a year later, some Nazis at an NOI rally. In 1962, a really important event happened. The real turning point for Malcolm and the Nation of Islam. The LAPD killed a Nation of Islam member, and they also injured a bunch of others. Malcolm immediately says, they're going to pay for it. You can see he had pictures printed. They had pictures printed up and were, agitating around it. But Muhammad stayed the NOI's hand. He didn't want to do anything. And so really, they came to a point where the nation had been effective as a propaganda group. But at this point in 1963, abstention from action decreased their effectiveness. They were, they had 120,000 members. They could intervene further. So ultimately, Malcolm would leave the NOI for the same reason he joined. He wanted to fight for Black liberation. So a little bit about Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X. Muhammad shunned politics. Malcolm was driven by them. Muhammad was rhetorically radical, but practically conservative and frankly abstentionist from struggle, political struggle, not just voting or whatever. Malcolm was a propagandist, brilliant propagandist and would-be agitator. He wanted action. He wanted civil rights activism. Muhammad was a sectarian, and I don't mean that in the religious sense so much as in the political sense. He forbade coalition. Although he was certainly a religious sectarian as well, he forbade coalition, particularly with orgs with white members, whereas Malcolm wanted to forge solidarity between Muslim and non-Muslim Black people, and then very late in his life opened up to the idea of organizing with white people, in fact. In December of 1963, John F. Kennedy was assassinated, rest in peace. Malcolm said that his assassination was a product of the hate and violence of white society. Malcolm was under specific orders to not talk about it, but kind of got caught off guard and did some little side interview and said, they said, what do you think? He said, well, being an old farm boy myself, chickens coming home to roost, Kennedy being assassinated because of the violence that the US projects everywhere, never made me sad. It always made me glad. And it's what a joy to behold someone saying that. But Elijah Muhammad did not agree. He called this a blunder. He said the country loved this man. And he suspended Malcolm for 90 days. The incident ended up being the perfect pretext to isolate him from the Nation of Islam overall. So a few months later, March of 1964 begins Malcolm's independent period. He leaves the Nation of Islam. He founds a new organization called Muslim Mosque Incorporated. He wanted to separate politics and religion, yet he proclaimed our philosophy is Black nationalism. He wanted to work with non-Muslims, but he lost opportunities to recruit when interest was in his new course was at its height by founding a religious organization. He also wanted to avoid factionalism and like had this idea that we see a lot of, wanting to unite kind of, beyond what's politically possible. And so circling back to Malcolm's Black nationalism in the Nation of Islam period, he held what Brightman called pure and simple Black nationalism, basically strictly concerned with the Black community, not the problems of larger society, for which he had no theory or program. In his independent period, he came to believe that society as a whole must be changed. And Brightman says this is not a contradiction, but an addition. And he realized that a Black-controlled Black community in a reactionary, exploitative system cannot provide freedom. For genuine liberation, Black people must fight to change society and to reconstruct it on a non-exploitative basis. This was a revolutionary turn for Malcolm, and it made him dangerous. In April of 1964, he delivers the ballot or the bullet speech at a CORE rally in Cleveland. He travels to Egypt, Nigeria, Tanzania, Kenya, Ghana, and Saudi Arabia. And while there, he made a proposal to indict the US before the UN for racism, and kind of calling the UN like the so-called world court as it's, I guess, supposed to be thought of. And he sought the support of African leaders and US civil rights leaders, but basically failed. And at the time, Brightman criticized this proposal of Malcolm's for being too optimistic and kind of, having illusions that that the UN could do anything but serve the interests of the US. And Malcolm ended up sending Brightman a message of thanks for that article, and that was, so critical. It's pretty cool. So, that a little bit about Malcolm and socialism. I wanted to call this little series of slides Malcolm's Socialism, but I hesitated, and we could talk about that more. But in this period, in his independent period, he began to internationalize Black struggle and connect it to the fight against capitalism, imperialism, and colonialism. That's undeniable. He began to advocate for socialism and world revolution. He gave up advocacy of a separate Black nation and of Black-owned businesses as a solution to the plight of Black people. Excuse me. In May of 1964, he said, all of the countries that are emerging today from the shackles of colonialism are turning toward socialism. I don't think it's an accident. Most of the countries that were colonial powers were capitalist countries. And the last bulwark of capitalism today is America. It's impossible for a white person to believe in capitalism and to not believe in racism. You can't have capitalism without racism. And if you find one, and you happen to get that person into a conversation and they have a philosophy that makes you sure they don't have this racism in their outlook, usually their political philosophy is socialism. So Brightman says Malcolm's interest in socialism was mostly stimulated abroad. I find this a little bit hard to believe because the SWP was around so much, or they were around each other so much. This is what Brightman says. He met with Nasser and Nkrumah and many others on his multiple trips. Malcolm saw socialism as synonymous with national independence and economic development. Malcolm's socialism lacked a class analysis of African regimes, and as well as a class analysis of cross-class alliances among Black people in the US. And it lacked the concept of workers' power, working class self-emancipation, and workers as the agents of change. Malcolm was dismissive of what he called this worker solidarity thing as late as May of 1964, which I assume was due to just impatience with white working class racism. All right, in June of 1964, Malcolm founded an additional organization called the Organization for Afro-American Unity. This was an explicitly political, non-religious, non-sectarian group, and it tried to be non-competitive with other organizations. This was one of the goals that Malcolm stated. So he was caught in a bit of a bind here. As Brightman said, the two things that Malcolm wanted simultaneously: to promote a new militant movement that would attract the best elements in the moderate organizations, and to avoid a head-on clash with the leaders of these organizations, or even with their cooperation. These two things were not compatible. Bending over backwards is not the proper stance for reaching the masses. So a little bit more about this kind of tension between negotiation and struggle. And here I'm, referring to Malcolm and the mainstream civil rights movement, and I'm sorry, Martin, and then Malcolm on the other side. There were sort of two paths available. One would be to negotiate joint action with the sort of mass moderate organizations, to tone down militancy, to appeal to them, to emphasize points of agreement, and that would require the kind of organization that was loose and not very disciplined and made like kind of low-level demands on members. And Brightman says the other path that was available was to force leaders of moderate organizations to join joint action or be deposed or deserted by their followers. And this would, require a different course where differences were emphasized, and where we would openly compete for political support. And then the type of organization would require leaders and members that are committed to their program, their methods, their internal education, and their external propaganda. That can't be done with a non-competitive org. Malcolm said, I guess I will have to go to the people first and let the leaders fall in behind them. But that is, a form of competition. And really what Brightman is talking about here is the United Front and the concept of the Revolutionary Party. That stuff should be familiar to us. All right. A little more on Malcolm's socialism. This is a picture from February, but the quote is from January of 1965, if that matters. Malcolm said, it's impossible for capitalism to survive, primarily because the system of capitalism needs some blood to suck. Capitalism used to be like an eagle, but now it's more like a vulture. It can only suck the blood of the helpless. In this time, Malcolm had increased proximity to the SWP. He was accused of abandoning Black nationalism for Trotskyism. And he talked strategy with the SWP. Some of the things that were mentioned that they talked about was like how to raise consciousness without presenting ideas that are too far in advance of the movement. Malcolm and the SWP talked about rejecting militant sounding declarations by people isolated from the movement, and rejecting dogma instead of trying to advance struggle. So I think those are really important conversation. In January of 1965, Malcolm questioned the use of the term Black nationalism after meeting with a white revolutionary in Africa, the Algerian ambassador to Ghana. He said, I was alienating people who were true revolutionaries, dedicated to the overthrowing of the system of exploitation that exists on this earth by any means necessary. On the question of organization, ultimately he came to believe that, quote, militant whites were the potential allies of African Americans. And it should be noted that he's talking about a political orientation, not a class location there. He maintained the need for separate Black organization. He came to believe that racial enmity was not inherent or immutable, and that genuine brotherhood is possible. On February 14th, 1965, Malcolm's home in Queens was firebombed. 4 days later, he's back out there. It's incorrect to classify the revolt of the Negro as simply a racial conflict of Black against white, or as purely an American problem. Rather, we are seeing today a global rebellion of the oppressed against the oppressor, the exploited against the exploiters. And this is in the Audubon Ballroom. Oh, okay, well, the picture's from February 15th, sorry. I had a great time going through pictures, and so I'm giving y'all a lot. But just a few days later, or 6 days later, after the previous photo, he's back in the Audubon Ballroom, and he's assassinated, just as he begins speaking at an OAAU rally. Malcolm's death was welcomed by defenders of the system. The New York Times said that he had a fanatical belief in violence. Elijah Muhammad said, Malcolm died according to his preaching. He preached war, we preached peace. I want to contrast this with a slogan that Marxists raise. It's from the French Revolution: peace to the huts, war to the palaces. It's not a damn thing wrong with being pro-war and preaching war of a certain kind. So as far as I'm concerned, Muhammad showed his ass and paid Malcolm a compliment. Thank God Malcolm preached war. Bayard Rustin said, Bayard Rustin was in CORE, later in the Socialist Party and then the Social Democrats of the USA. He was an organizer of, co-organizer with MLK of what Malcolm called the farce on Washington, not the March on Washington. Bayard Rustin wrote a series of articles after Malcolm X's death. He said Malcolm is not a hero of the movement, he's a tragic victim of the ghetto. He evaluated Malcolm from a quasi-radical left liberal standpoint, and the best thing he could say about him was that he helped civil rights orgs by scaring whites into negotiating with them. Just one more little point on that. This is because from Rustin's standpoint, the nonviolent gradualist civil rights movement was the only thing meaningful to him. So by contrast, the SWP continued to clarify and advance the best of Malcolm's legacy. You can see that this is the headline right after Malcolm was assassinated. They're calling it a cruel blow to the cause of Black emancipation. And then this is a pamphlet from years later that is continuing to talk about Malcolm. So a quick coming in for a landing here, y'all. Thanks for bearing with me. This is a quick overview of Malcolm's political development. He moved from separatism to internationalism and solidarity. He moved from essentialism to a materialist explanation of racial oppression. In other words, one that's connected to the economic and political system. He moved from pessimism to revolutionary optimism, from capitalism to socialism. Did Malcolm become a socialist in his last year? Yes and no. He definitely concluded that capitalism is the cause of racism, that you can't have capitalism without it, and therefore socialism should be considered as an objective by Black Americans as well as by people of color around the world. Regarding the optimism, that shift in identifying with a Black minority in the US to identifying with a global majority of oppressed nations and nationalities is a big part of that. And Brightman said that Malcolm was on the way to a synthesis of Black nationalism and socialism that would be fitting for the American scene and acceptable to the masses in the Black ghetto. So Malcolm's legacy continues to resonate in the struggle for Black liberation and abolition, both of which are essential to and really identical with the Communist project. So if we are to make a science of revolution, we must study and apply the lessons of a revolutionary as important as Malcolm X. Thanks, y'all.